you will notice that we begin with English Romantic verse, that is the small volume here. And I ask you that for last night, to look at several of those writers who once upon a time would have been called pre-Romantic writers. There are other terms for them, I'll discuss those. But some of those who in the later part of the 18th century sort of led the way in certain ways, or anticipated in certain ways, the sort of full-fledged romanticism that would begin developing with William Blake and Wordsworth. We continue with English Romantic verse, which I abbreviate ERV, in the second B reading, the next group of readings, and those will focus on William Blake. I'd love to have more time to deal with Blake. He's a very important figure, but I will only be with him in a somewhat selective way, but we will spend a bit of time on him. Then we come to Wordsworth, and this is the volume, Wordsworth's selected verse that we return to, and there the readings will be pretty substantial, and the time we spend will also be very substantial. You remember my little sort of plan last time, which was to cover all of the major Romantic poets, but to cover one of them in sort of a scale across a wide range of works. Wordsworth is sort of my task there, and so when we get there, we will sort of chunk in for a good long day. He is really a very, very great importance. Then we return to the English Romantic verse volume and a look at Wordsworth's collaborator and friend, Simon Pennant Folders, with the major exhibit there being, as you can almost expect, Romney English Mariner, which is one of them as well. Then we return to, or rather not return, but go on to the one complete work that we will meet, which is Byron's gigantic romantic satire. It's hard to come up with precise terms for God to really, and that's one of the things most romantic about it. It's sort of everything. So romantic satire needs to be shorthand term for perhaps too, and we will be here for some time. Then we end with two major, not end quite, but come to the end of the major phase of Romanticism with two important poets, most of God must be young, and that is the selection within English Romantic verse from Shelley, Shelley, and John Keats. The last section, the literally last section, deals with what might be considered the sort of dying fall of Romanticism. Just as Romanticism was not born overnight, it did not decline overnight. That is when Keats and Shelley died in 1821 and 1822. Romanticism did not stop at that point. It was actually a very gifted group of writers, and I've given some of them here, not all of them, but a substantial selection of them, who really carried on the Romantic tradition, but with declining force, I think it's fair to say. Something new was clearly in the wind, something that by the 1830s was going to be the new phase of literature in the 19th century. That would, as I said last night, not leave Romanticism totally behind by any means, but would really develop into something recognizably different from Romanticism. And that was, of course, the Victorian movement of the last 2/3 of time. What marks these writers as interesting is that they worked very hard to remain committed to a kind of pure romantic program at a time when most literary culture was going in other directions. And perhaps because of that, because particularly with romanticism, the world is becoming increasingly something else, their production is very interesting, but it is also limited. And it's very interesting, at least to me, and I hope it's going to be to sort of realize the human aspect of the sort of art of romanticism. That is, when you look, I think romanticism in its essential nature is a high-risk way of living and writing. It just is. It takes chances. It lives with its heart to some degree on its sleeve. You know, I've sometimes thought that romanticism is inherently manic depressive. That is, romanticism is always dealing with high and low. The classical periods of culture, and especially neoclassicism, which came like for romanticism, tend to deal very little with the ecstatic heights of possibility and very little with the, what can I say, the tragic depth of human possibility, and to try to center itself in what might be called the moderate and humane middle, and stays there as much as it possibly can. So that even when it deals with tragic things, it deals with them from a sort of comic point of view. And if you don't know what I mean by that, just consider something like Swift's Modest Proposal, which comes from the height and classical period. And what is he dealing with? Poverty and misery and starvation. And how does he deal with it in a satiric, ironic, and comic, although darkly comic spirit? Same thing can be applied, of course, to Gulliver's Travels generally, which has to do with all kinds of really terrible things. But I defy anybody to read it without laughing, more or less, from beginning to end. And that's pretty typical of the neoclassicals. Even if we deal with harsh things, deal with them in a spirit of rational self-control, and that is typical of neoclassicism. Romanticism deals things deep, whether it is the great heights or the great depths. One writer who is a kind of transition figure, who has sort of one foot in the neoclassical age and one foot in the romantic age. We will not be reading it, but he's interesting. His name is Horace Walpole, son of an English prime minister, great letter writer, and in fact the father of the Gothic novel. That's how he has a foot sort of in the development of romance. The Gothic novel, all those novels, ghosts and goblins, things that go off in the night and all of that. You may think, things like Blackula and Frankenstein and even to a degree Wuthering Heights. You might think that that's fairly modern or at any rate romantic development. It really was. It was an 18th century development. And Horace Walpole, in his novel called The Castle of Otranto, which came out in the 1760s, is the beginning of the Gothic novel. But he said something that I've always thought very profound about the difference between neoclassicism and romanticism. He said, life is the tragedy for those who feel and a comedy for those who think. Think about it. Life is the tragedy for those who feel and a comedy for those who think. I think it's fair to say in broad terms, neoclassical age was for the most part a thinking age, and therefore a comic age. Its typical ways of writing are satiric, ironic, comic. Give an example of my head that I hope will mean something to at least a couple of you. A great art historian, Sir Kenneth Clark, did a book many years ago, 30 years ago now, called Civilization, which sort of traces Western civilization through art, through the visual art. And when he gets to the 18th century, the neoclassical age, he entitled his chapter on the neoclassical age, The Smile of Reason. Smile of Reason. And what he gives is, on the page right next to that chapter heading, he has a Udon sculptor, an Udon bust of Voltaire, great French neoclassical writer. And there's old Voltaire, straight no doubt, writing can't be that very laughing satire on all terrible things of life. You think you're bad because you lost one part of your ass? Let me show you. I lost both parts of my ass. Really is a seed in Candy, as you may know, truly. There again, the laughing sort of quality of the neoclassical age. But Kenneth Clark showed me sculpture of Voltaire. And old Voltaire is an old man in this sculpture. He doesn't have any teeth much left at all. But he's turning around, writing, and he's turning around, and this sort of old man grin, as if to say, I've seen all there is in life, and I'm amused by it. No matter how bad it is, it amuses. That is not the romantic spirit. That is not. The romantic spirit is heartfelt. It is throbbing with passion. It feels like ecstasy and life's tragedy with equal intensity and passion. That's what romanticism is all about. It is, as I say, sort of inherently manic depressive, as we would say. It knows great heights, great depths, and we will find that all the way through. Now, you can almost tell from the way I discuss romanticism that to some degree romanticism can be seen as a kind of reaction against neoplasticity. Now, I don't mean that in a mechanical way, like you have neoplasticism, and there had to be something to react to that. Bing bong, like sort of for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's not what I'm getting at. But I think if you look at the history of culture, or the history of literature, or the history of the arts, or the history of anything, what you will see is that in one period, certain things, certain values, certain ways of looking at the world are seen to be natural, inevitable, they make sense. In the Middle Ages, it made sense to view everything from the point of view of eternity, the point of view of faith, the point of view of God, the point of view of sort of theological philosophy, what they call ecclesiastical philosophy, or scholastic philosophy. That seemed as natural to them as computers, highways, and electric toothbrushes seem to us. I'm wrong. Every age has things that seem inevitable, natural. That's the way it is. The only trouble is the way it is, what's natural, what's inevitable, is constantly changing. In the Middle Ages, it was one thing, an age of faith, an age of trust. It seemed just as natural to them to build thousands of Gothic cathedrals that took 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and sometimes 1,000 years to build. That were all for the glory of God, as it does to us to build the Sears Towers and the Empire State Building, which are surely cathedrals in praise of money. One seemed natural in the Middle Ages, the other seemed natural enough, perhaps. They're obviously based on a totally different view of the world. Now, after the Middle Ages, what followed was a kind of reaction in which a world that was defined purely in spiritual, theological, divine, Christian terms no longer seemed big enough. There needed to be more, something a little bit more basically human, something that dealt with the ordinary passion, the ordinary experience of life in a more colorful and intense, human and concrete way, and there needed to be more knowledge about that. Examples of how to do that, how to think about political reality, how to think about emotional reality, how to think about personal reality, and all the rest of them. And so what you get, of course, is that great period of culture we call the Renaissance, in which the rediscovery of the classical past is carried on. That is, the classical reason at all. Not because they were interested in just going back and raking up old stuff, but because they were looking for models of how to live life fully on a human and secular basis. Now, that does not mean that Christianity disappeared in the Renaissance. It most certainly did not. But it was blended with another great force that you can call Renaissance humanism, that involved a new definition of reality that was combined, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes not so harmoniously, with the Christianity of the Middle Ages to produce a new culture. All you have to do is look at Dante from the Middle Ages with his vision of life that is all in terms of infinitude, eternity. For Dante, where is reality? It's inferno, purgatorio, paradiso, right? That's where that is. It's hell, purgatory, and heaven. That's where reality is to be found. That's typical of the Middle Ages. When Shakespeare comes along, who is perhaps the greatest poet of the Renaissance in Europe, where does he see reality as being? Look around. See human beings from top to bottom and east to west. See them in all of their complex human reality. We do not have a single Shakespearean play that takes place in hell, or in heaven, or purgatorio. His vision is not up and down, it's across. It's latitudinal. It's looking at human reality in an ordinary sort of human way. That's difficult to Renaissance. Can you think of any other Renaissance writer who looks at the world pretty much that way? They all do, pretty over one great extent. How about, to move across the water a little bit from England, how about another great Renaissance writer, the Spaniard, Cervantes? He's very much looking at the world as it sadly is, isn't it? I mean, and in fact, could we almost say that the whole problem with Don Quixote is that he, God bless his heart, can't bear to accept the mundane reality of the world. So for him, windmills become giants, Dulcinea becomes magnificent, and all the rest of the kind of mind games he plays on himself so that he can live in a world of romance. But of course, to remind us that we're really in a world of very human reality, we have Pacho Panza, right? Beside him constantly saying, yes, master, but, and telling him, of course, about the harsh and calming reality of everyday life. The Renaissance was in every possible sense of the word, whether you're looking at literature or you look at just general culture during that time. It was a period that was expanding, moving, changing. It was incredibly dynamic. And sometimes, you know, there's that joke, it's supposedly Chinese curse like, may you live in interesting times. Supposed to be first. Did you see why living in interesting times might be first? I don't know about you, but I'd like to live sometimes in boring times. Why would that be? In boring times, you have what? No great character, no great conflict, no great war, no great, earth-shattering changes. There's something to be said for that, believe me. But the Chinese curse, if indeed it is the Chinese curse, could be, may you live an interesting time, could easily have been written about the Renaissance. I suspect it was the most intensely interesting period you could almost, in the whole history of Western civilization, found. But it was also a period in which the problems of exploring a new world, the problems of intense warfare in every imaginable direction, things like the all that. After all, the final, one of the things that happened in the Renaissance toward the end are things like tremendous numbers of people being burned at the stake, the Spanish Inquisition, the burning of witches in this country, basically a sort of tail end part of the Renaissance. People felt intensely about everything, and they fought out those intense disagreements in very bloody sorts of ways. It was energetic, it was creative, it was a profoundly interesting period, but it was also a period in which conflict, violence, and problems were very much wrought. All you have to think of is some of the monarchs of the time in England, right? The two most important Renaissance monarchs in England were Henry VIII, and actually, it could have looked at Henry VIII as a historical period. There is much about him that's intelligent. There's much that is highly cultivating. He was very much interested in what he saw as England's best good, what was good for England. But in order to bring about those supposedly good values, he had to do a lot of pretty nasty stuff. Sometimes perhaps a lot more nasty than he needed to have done, although he would have argued on the other side. If you're thinking about, as I dare say you might, Henry VIII, many wives, and the somewhat tragic history of those wives, you have but one example. That is only one example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. And then even someone later, greater monarch, Elizabeth I, what does she have to do? She ends up in her life having to, at various times, put probably the two men that she cared the most about to death because they were politically inconvenient to her. And finally, a close kinswoman whom she did not want to have put to death, but finally felt that she had to, who was that? Who did Elizabeth I finally have to put to death? Scotch. Mary, Queen of Scots. Yes, you get the idea. Well, she wasn't meaning exactly, but the political realities were so stressful and difficult and unsettled at the time that it was necessary. Many of the writers of the time emphasized it. They emphasized the fact that if you think about the tragedies during the Renaissance, things like King Lear and Macbeth, and bloody tragedies like the White Devil and Trinidad, or the Duchess of Malta, the Revenger's tragedy, or any of those, they were full of revenge and blood and strange forms of death. And all you have to think of is Hamlet contemplating the skull, that he finds when he's out in the grave digging scene. And it turns out, of course, the last poor Yorick, I knew him well, a fellow of infinite jest, crying all that. This is what it all comes to. What did he finally say? Go to my lady's bedchamber, tell her, let her paint an inch thick, yet to this favor will she come. And that idea of the sort of skull beneath the skin, the sort of horror of death lurking around every corner, was the sort of dark underside of the sort of glorious Renaissance that was there. That's reflected throughout the culture of that time. It was a stressful as well as a highly creative time. The neoclassical age came after that, here in Anderson's 15-minute survey of Western civilization. But the neoclassical age comes afterwards, and I think we sometimes misunderstand it. It did not get all dry and wrinkled and pruny based on a kind of hyper-developed rationality. In other words, it did not turn into a bunch of rational philosophers who thought reason to solve every problem whatsoever. That's a stereotype. That's not what happened. But what it did try to do was to restore human culture and restore human art to a somewhat more common sense and reasonable, middle-of-the-road, balanced sort of reality. It felt that it could understand things to a serious degree through the exercise of the analytic reason. Whereas in the Renaissance, it had been much more a matter of sort of will and determination and Machiavellian cleverness and all of that. But in the Renaissance, in the neoclassical age, and when did that begin? In England, about 1660, the neoclassical age began. It happens in part because Charles II, who was the victim of one of the surges of Renaissance energy, which we call the English Civil War. And of course, he wasn't the big victim, Charles II. His predecessor, Charles I, was the big victim. In fact, what happened to Charles I? Yes, he lost his head, you might say, over the Renaissance. He was beheaded. His kinsman, and should have been Professor Charles II, had to go away to France. While he was there on what he always literally called his travel. He was not traveling. What was? He was in exile. What? He was hiding from his enemies back in England under Oliver Cromwell and so forth. But eventually Oliver Cromwell died. And the problem then becomes, gosh, how do we order society? The fellow who was a certain guru of the Commonwealth, of the Puritan Revolution, is dead. What do we do? And it sort of shows that they didn't quite know what to do, that they tried to make the son of all the sort of next, like, okay, we don't have a king anymore. Now that we've got to come up with a way of ruling England, I guess we'll use the son of the leader we have, as if he were a king. But it turned out that Richard Cromwell was the miserable disaster of all. And so it was time for a change. And most people in England at that point, at least people who had power and influence, felt it is what we want England back. We want the realm of England, that is the kingdom of England back. And so the question became, can we bring back Charles II? Will he return as king? And he, of course, said yes. And he did come back in 1660. That's called the restoration of the English monarchy. And with it comes not only the restoration of the English monarchy, but really the development of neoclassical literature in England. And why would that happen? Because when Charles II was over in France, he was at the court of Louis XIV. And Louis XIV, the Sun King, was not only the great monarch of Europe, he really was, He resided over the most powerful nation in Europe, but it wasn't just powerful in military or economic. It was also cultural, by far the most powerful nation in Europe. It was producing writers like Molière and Racine, and Vernet, and La Fontaine, and La Bruyère, and these names, some of them will maybe mean familiar, some may not, but trust me, they're important writers in their own way. In France, they called the kind of style they were developing in the middle of the 17th century French classicism. And of course, this became neoclassicism in England when it was sort of transferred or came over France on English soil. This is not a class in neoclassicism, obviously, but rather its successor romanticism. So I'm going to have to do a very, very supervision job of sort of suggesting what neoclassicism is all about. But the writers that England produced, neoclassical writers, are people like Dryden, people like Poe, people like Henry Fielding, people like Samuel Johnson, people like James Boswell, people like Lawrence Sterne, people like the great historian Gibbon, some of the lesser writers like John Gay, there are a lot of them. And it is a very rich period, very important, and it lasts for a long time. Its essential domination of English literature lasts from about 1660 to roughly 1800. And it is in this context, this neoclassical context, that the first elements of Romanticism began to develop. Partly, no doubt, as a kind of reaction against neoclassicism. Because neoclassicism was powerful, it was useful, it was highly creative, it produced a tremendous body of art, law, architecture, and literature that was of tremendous value. But like every other age that has ever come along, it inevitably sort of valorized or placed great stress on certain things and a whole lot less stress on other things. Now, what did it value? It valued, on the whole, common sense and reason over, well, imagination and feeling. That's an oversimplification, but basically speaking, it is true. It valued clarity and structure in almost everything it did, whether it was architecture, thought, or literature, over spontaneity and sort of coloring of that, what I say, highly individual mode of expression. It valued city life over country life. If you've ever read Molière's great play, Tartuffe, you may remember that there is precisely one reference to the countryside in all of Tartuffe. And that is when Orgon, the father of the household, returns to the country, and his brother-in-law, Cleon, greets him at the door and says, basically, I'm translating here, he says, "How is the country, brother? Blooming, I trust, and green." That's it. That is the whole reference to the countryside in the whole way. If you know the poems of Dryden, poems of Poe, I think you'll agree with me that there is very little intense feeling for nature. There is almost none of that in Dryden and very little of it in Poe. If you think about poems like, I'm trying to think something I've read in the survey course, something like Dryden's Reflecto, which obviously deals with the writing, some condition of literature in the 17th century, that doesn't have much to do. In fact, it's all about London and where the Thames flows and all the rest. And how about the Rape of the Law? Pope's probably best known work. It doesn't deal with the country at all, except, well, an occasional reference to the Thames flowing through the countryside between London and Hampton Court. That is the two sort of city-fied, cultivated places where all the real action takes place. Also, the literature of the neoclassical age puts a lot more emphasis on what might be considered discursive, intellectual, and philosophical matters than personal, emotional, private sorts of matters. If we're used to poetry today, here we are, for better or worse, as sort of, I will look into my belly button and tell you what I found there. I mean, there's a lot of that. I'm not just being silly. There in 20th century poetry, for instance, we have a major development in modern American poetry in the 40s, 50s called the confessional school of poetry. And poets like, say, Robert Lowell in the 20th century or Sylvia Plath in the 20th century are obvious examples of that. And then, of course, unlike those two poets who are really quite distinguished, we have 8 million zillion undergraduates who, well, I'm afraid at a considerably lower level, are convinced that their latest emotional crisis is sort of literature without doing much to it. You know, all you're going to have to do is just write it down with a lot of exclamation. And you've got instant literature. Well, as the kids say on the playground, or used to years ago, not. But you know, it tells you sort of where you can often tell what the condition literature is at your age by looking at the bad as well as the good. And we have a lot of, I'm afraid, all read stuff, you know, about my latest emotional crisis, whatever it may be. You would not have found that in the neoclassical age at all. The poets of that age viewed the public world, the philosophical world of ideas, as where a poet ought to be. So, for instance, as some of you will know, what does Pope do when he is a very brilliant and young poet? He devotes himself to the writing of a work which he calls an essay on criticism. If you know the essay on criticism, you will know it is not an essay in our sense at all. It's a poem about the elements of criticism. It begins. It's hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill, but of the two, less grievous the offense to tire our patience than mislead our sin. You see, it's an essay in what? In verse. And when he gets to be a more mature poet, he writes an essay on an even bigger philosophical issue, not literary criticism this time, but what he calls his essay on man. And that, too, is by which he means mankind. What does he say there? He says, the proper study of mankind is man, one of the lines, placed on the isthmus of the middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great. Talking about the mixed nature of humanity. So it's brilliantly written. It's wonderful poetry, it really is. But it is poetry of ideas, poetry of discourse. The same is true of Dryden to a very large degree. Trying to begin one of his finest poems this way. Well then, the promised hour is come at last. The present age of wit obscures the last. Our sides were strong, and as they fought, they writ, winning by force of arms and dint of wit. He writes a poem in which he basically talks about the shift from what we would call the Renaissance to the Neoclassical age. See, they were strong, but they didn't have the elements we do. That's really what he's talking about in that open, and what he was on to talk about. In other words, it's poetry that deals with ideas, with concepts, rather than with personal feeling. There's not much personal feeling in Dryden, but there's a lot of fun in Dryden. When Dryden begins one of his poems like this, he says, this is Absalom Kitterfeld, probably his most important poem, where he says, in pious times every priestcraft began before polygamy was made a sin, when man on many multiplied his kind, and what he's doing is kind of creating a never land of sexual promiscuity in which a king like King David, when he's writing about the Bible, is okay, and a king like Charles II, who was also pretty promiscuous, and that's what he's really writing about, can also be okay. But it's funny, it's historical, it's intellectual. You are not going to find Dryden telling you about Dryden's latest emotional crisis or what it felt like when he fell in love. If he ever fell in love, he didn't write about it. Pope didn't much either. Pope's much more likely to talk about create a poem in which it sounds like conversation. For instance, and one in one of his most brilliant poems, he's talking about being tired. He's talking about how he's gotten to be a famous man and everybody wants to come and see him, and he doesn't want to see anybody anymore. So what does he say at the end of his poem? John Arthur said, shut the door, good John. Fatigued, I said. Tie up the knot and say I'm stiff, I'm dead. The dog's sitting here, see what I mean? Tell him, go away. I don't want to see anybody. Tell him I'm sick. Tell him I'm dead. Tie up the knocker. What does he mean by that? Put a sort of bandana or anything around the knocker so that it won't knock. So that it's beauty. Tie up the knocker. Say I'm sick. I'm dead. The dog star rages. Gage is passed all down. All bedlam or Parnassus is let out. In other words, the dog says plop, and of course, what's supposed to happen when the dog star rages? That's the hot constellation. It involves Sirius. It's like in July, things have got too hot, people have gone nuts, and what do they all do? All bedlam, which is where they kept the lunatic, or Parnassus, which is where the poets supposed to be, is let out. Fire in each eye, and papers in each hand, they rage, recite, and madden throughout the land. You know, Stony creates this hilarious satiric vision of a world inhabited by bad poets going from door to door. Read this, look at this. And he said, shut the door. I don't want to deal with these people. Leave me alone. This must free. It's not exactly, though, what we expect of poetry these days. Because, well, the main reason it's not what we expect is that we are great-great-grandchildren of, guess what? Romance. Now, when Romanticism began to develop, what form did it take? Well, I think it's fair to say in certain ways, and we can look at some of the works that you read last night, it is looking for some alternative to the neoclassical world. The neoclassical world was civilized and elegant and polished, but maybe it was a little bit too civilized for some people. That is to say, wouldn't it be nice if we could at least occasionally get a glimpse of something wild and primitive and strange instead of things that are civilized, elegant, and rationally understand? And that was one of the impulses, I think, that led, in other words, a kind of longing for, or a hunger for, the primitive, the heroic, the wild, the romantic. This is really what the word romantic originally meant. It simply meant something that was beyond ordinary, rational sort of consideration. You could have a romantic landscape, that is one that was too wild. In other words, not like a garden, but like a kind of wild, great mountains and soaring cliffs. That can be a romantic landscape, and that's the way the word was originally used. Or you could have a romantic feeling, but what that meant was it was originally not a positive thing at all. It meant a feeling that was not properly governed by reason, by intelligence, by decorum, and so forth. And you'll find in many 18th century novels someone saying, oh, don't be romantic. Meaning, of course, don't be extravagant. Don't be foolish. Don't be silly. That's really what the word in the 18th century mainly meant. If you read Jane Austen, who lived in the Romantic period, but was not a romantic at all. In fact, she was. However much the movie makers try to make her out to be, she was a classic neoclassical sort of writer. And if you have really read one of her novels, you will know how true that is. For instance, what's the beginning of Pride and Prejudice? Do you remember saying this? It is a truth universally acknowledged that a young man in possession of a great fortune must be in want of a woman. Well, now there is a romantic view of marriage, isn't it? No. It is an ironic, humorous, comic view based on the idea that most marriages are marriages of what? Material convenience. For better or worse, they are. Now, of course, there are ways of escaping that, and Elizabeth Bennet, to some degree, does escape that. But she is the one who does. Others, not so much. Charlotte Lucas, in that novel, settles and explains why she said. And more of you settled for that miserable clergyman that she married. You've settled, haven't you? Nothing romantic about that. Or if you read something like Northanger Abbey, for parody of the Gothic novel. She makes fun of the romantic Gothic. novel, and her heroine there, what's her name, Catherine Moore, I think, she says at the beginning, there was nothing apparent in the appearance or the mind or the behavior of Catherine Moore that would have qualified her for a romantic heroine. And in fact, there isn't. She's a trapped, small, prosaic little girl who has convinced herself that she is a romantic heroine. And in fact, the whole novel is a kind of satire on romantic self-delusion. If you've read or even seen the movie Sense and Sensibility, there you have it. Now, sensibility is the sort of romantic tendency, but it doesn't go too far. Sensibility is okay. Not bad. A little silly sometimes, pretty silly. But you'll notice the girl in the novel, the sister in the novel who represents sensibility, does not, in fact, end up marrying a handsome, dashing young man she thinks she is romantically attracted to, but she marries a stable, decent, honest, older man who, in fact, is not terribly romantic, but is very decent and good at all. And, of course, the other sister never for one moment thinks about things in those romantic terms. So during the later 18th century, what you get is neoclassicism holding on to a very great degree to general culture, general literature. The fact that Samuel Johnson, if you will read Samuel Johnson, who is very neoclassic, very much of neoclassic literature, dominates. In fact, he was called by many writers of the time the great Cham of literature, which means like the great, what would you say, the great Poobah of literature, the great emperor of grand wizard, I don't know, of literature. And the fact that he dominated the last half of the 18th century tells you that neoclassicism did not go away. The fact that Jane Austen is still alive and well and brilliant productive in the early 19th century, at the same time that Wordsworth and Coleridge and Byron are writing their poems, tells you that neoclassicism did not go away, even after Romanticism had pretty much won the day. But there were strong impulses. One of them is, as I say, this search for the primitive, the wild, the heroic, that of course the neoclassical civilized age did not really satisfy. Was there anything you read last night that very clearly reflects that love of the wild and the primitive, or the longing for it? Do you know anything about Thomas Gray at all? Or heard Thomas Gray? He has the distinction of having probably written the single most popular one poem in the English language. I say that because it has been more often reprinted, more often translated, more often read, and more often anthologized than any other poem in the English language. It's not one of the ones that you would expect to get. What's his most famous one? No, that's Herod. You think Herod. Gather ye rosebuds, follow ye man, old time. That's 17th century. The great one, here's how it began. The curfew tolls the knell of party day. The lowing herd winds slowly. The plowman homeward plods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness. It has a few famous lines, like, far from the madding crowds in noble strife, the paths of glory lead but to the grave. It really is tremendous. It's called the Elegy in a Country Churchyard. Yay, we do know that. That's good. But it is a very important poem. Now, if we look a little bit more into Thomas Gray, what do we find? This was a man who was in many ways straight 18th century. He really was. He had a formidable classical education. He was probably the best educated man of his time. Either he or Samuel Johnson, or some talk point between. He had read everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. He read Latin and wrote it with just pieces wrote in. Greek, same thing. French, Italian, German, Scandinavian tongues, including Old Icelandic. He was a scholar of profound learn. He also was probably one of the most learned naturalists that he got through all that thought. Wow. He was just a tremendously learned, very much an intellect, fairly typical of me. He was a scholar, he was officially a scholar. That is, he was a professor, what we would call a professor, what they would call a fellow, at Cambridge University and lived most of his life in the cloistered halls of that great university. He was a civilized, urbane man of the world and culture. You read his letters and you think, the 18th century, with all its civilization, all of its urbanity, with all its intelligence, its learning, that's the 18th century. But then you pick up this volume, and here's Thomas Gray, and the first poem you've got is The Fatal Sisters. What the devil is the Fatal Sisters about? Well, you know, from the Norse tongue. Now, it's not literally a translation. What he's done is he's taken elements of Nordic or Old Germanic mythology, and he has written a new poem roughly in the style of Nordic poems. Now, these are very primitive sorts of poems, aren't they? It's really close to things like, well, what is our version in English of Nordic or Old Germanic literature? I mean, of the Dark Ages, the early Middle Ages. We have versions of that in English, don't we? You read one, I bet you. Beowulf is an example. The Wanderer, the Seafarer, the Dream of the Root, things like that. But the poems he's looking at here are even older than that. They are really from the Dark Ages, and they go back to mythic, legendary, Old Germanic, Old Norse sort of legend. Anyone guess who the Fatal Sisters are here, baby? Let me give you a hint. An auditory hint. That's who they are. The Fatal Sisters here. Those maidens in Germanic legend who, of course, preside over battle and go out and swoop up the hero to die on the battlefield after determined destinies of battle. And, of course, in Wagner's Germanic legendary mythic opera, he is, that music is to indicate the ride of the Valkyrie as they go to gather up the dead heroes who died, to take them off to Valhalla, right? The sort of Nordic, Germanic heaven for those who die in battle. This is not the neoclassical 18th century. This is not a drawing room. This is not Mozart. This is not elegant, civilized life. In fact, what are these Fatal Sisters like? Here, they're like, do they remind you of anything else other than the Valkyrie? Let me read a little bit of it. I'll be done. Now the storm begins to lower, haste the loom of hell prepare, iron sheet of airy shower, hurdles in the darkened air. Does this sound like? Yes! Bubble, bubble, toil and bubble. And of course there we have what? The Gothic, the supernatural, the strange, the bizarre, and also the modern, right? Glittering lamps are the loom, where the dusky warp we strain, weaving many a soldier's doom, what these woe and rander's bane, or remember obviously soldiers, warriors, who are going to die in battle. Now they are weaving the sort of texture of destiny here. And what do they weave it out of? God, I don't know what people thought of this when it came out in the 18th century. But of course what Gray would say is, I don't mean it to be taken all that serious. I'm simply recreating as a kind of antiquarian game the violent, heroic legends of the mythic early medieval past. Of course, I, as a civilized man, don't have any great interest in such a thing. What does that allow him to do? Have fun. That is to sort of dive off into the wild, violent, heroic past and escape the elegant, civilized polish of his own age. I mean, listen to this not only in terms of what it says, but how it says the rhythm, the movement. And notice how far we are from what? Let me think about it. Hidden glittering textures filled with food. That's called the count of silk, to raise the law. Or what is it now? The great account of Belinda, if you remember, putting on her makeup when she trembling begins the sacred rites of pride. As she puts on her makeup and hear what the elephant and tortoise unite for transformed to coals, the speckle. What happens to elephants and tortoises? They're made into ivory combs and tortoiseshell combs so that a beautiful girl can fly. That's the world of the 18th century. Nice china, nice silver, beautiful architecture, Mozart in the background, and everything is beautiful in the garden. What is Gray, meanwhile, doing sitting in Cambridge there? What kind of dreams have you got? See the grisly texture grow, 'tis of human impulse made. Human impulse. This is not elegant at all. This is horrifying. And the weights that play below each a gasping warrior's head. And it goes on in that sort of theatrically bloody, violent, heroic, primitive sort of way. What does skip down and say? Oh, let's go. Shafts for shovels dipped in gore before. Blood. Shoot the trembling cords along, sword that once a monarch bore, keep the tissues spokes and strong. This the black, terrific maid, and he means literally terrific. That is terrifying. Sangreda. What was sangreda? Blood, like sangria, the drink. Spanish, there you can say. And Hilda see, join the wayward work to aid, 'tis the woof of victory. That is, they're weaving the texture of the future. They also, in this sense, it reminds one a little bit, doesn't it, of the destinies in classical mythology. Weave the destinies of the future, very much that sort of thing. What we're going to have here, in other words, is war, blood, heroes, Valkyrie, bloodshed, and why would all that appeal to an over-refined, elegant professor of modern letters and history at Cambridge in the urbane 18th century? Well, that's exactly why it would. See, as it did to, is this the only example we have of that sort of thing? Did you read anything else, for instance, that maybe suggested a love of the primitive, the heroic, or the wild? Look at the brief selection from James Pearson over on page 51. This is from a collection of poems that McPherson published in the 1760s, 1770, called the Poems of Ossian. Now, James McPherson is an interesting figure. He was a Scot, and he tried to pull a little hope. Well, he did. He said, I have found the manuscripts of ancient Scottish, Nordic, Celtic poetry. And they deal, of course, with all kinds of heroic figures, dark landscapes, romantic violence and passion, and everything that the 18th century was. And he claimed that he had found these in various monasteries, and that he was going to edit them and translate them and then produce them for the public, which he did as the Poems of Ossian. And all kinds of people loved them. Thomas Gray, for instance, loved them. Oh, very, very. Napoleon, later on, thought they were magnificent, thought they were greater than Homer. There was only one problem. They were poems. McPherson didn't have maybe a few flags, but not much of Celtic or Gaelic, these the old sort of ancient languages of Scotland and Ireland. Didn't have them. He simply made up his idea of what a Celtic or Gaelic bard, notice bard, would call or tribe and call themselves bard. They would have called themselves wits. Men of the world who have a facility for writing verse.